So today I'm going to take you on a journey on one of the most important landscapes of my life, my grandma and my grandpa's garden. So the year is 1987 and my mum's dropping me off at Tucker Road, Bentleigh. And we walk through these really rusty, huge old gates that seemed so massive to me as a kid. I was so impressed by how strong my grandpa was to be able to even lift them open, probably just a normal size. And to the left, there was a curved garden bed edged with rocks. And there were beautiful big volcanic rocks all along the edge of this garden bed. And this gigantic Angophora costata tree. My grandmother bought it in the 1960s when most native plants weren't really commercially available, and she bought it as a dwarf. Fast forward to the 2000s and it was about 35 meters tall. It only recently just got cut down. It was a beautiful, huge tree, always full of ravens. I think there were about 3 nests in there. So I'm entering the gate. I'm super excited to spend the weekend at my grandma and grandpa's. My grandpa was the company secretary at Cadbury's, so we had endless supply of lollies, Chupa Chups, chocolates, all things that I was never allowed to eat at home. Very, very, very exciting. And underneath this incredible Angophora, there's a whole heap of different proteas. These beautiful proteas were growing in that poor grey tertiary sand that you get in Bentleigh. Never got watered one day in their life, flowered nearly all year round. So then you walked down past the Angophora, and then there was a fantastic Pandora jasminoides growing along this fence. And it felt like you were entering a secret garden. And in many ways, you were. There was another rusty gate here. And then when you walked through, you walked into this absolute world of wonder. So on the left-hand side here, there was a giant weeping callistemon. Again, used to flower all year round. And this was Betty's herb garden, where she had all the different herbs that she put into her delicious meals. She was an amazing cook. And then on this side was the hellhole, which was one of the spare rooms of the house. The hellhole was actually my dad's bedroom growing up. And he was kind of revered by my grandparents, so it was like a time capsule from the 1960s. It was a very weird little space, to be honest, but it seemed magical as a kid. It had this diagonal window that looked out into a huge cluster of hydrangea, macrophylla, and Japanese wisteria. And then there was a massive Monstera deliciosa growing along this fence. I remember trying the fruit when I was a kid. Like most tropical fruit that's not very common. Pretty bloody disgusting, to be honest. And here was this amazing Agonis flexiosa. The trunk on it, I think I need to make that actually a lot bigger because the trunk was gigantic. Me and my sister couldn't touch hands when we were both hugging the trunk of the tree. And it looked like a weeping willow. The leaves would weep right down to the ground plane. There were no paths beyond the hellhole. Everything was lawn paths, which were really beautiful. And everything was like conceal and reveal, that classic kind of garden-esque design with serpentine sweeping edges to the garden bed. So you walked up this little path here, and there were mollis azaleas, there were velhemia, forest lilies, cinerarias, bulbs. I'd say there was probably at least 500 different species of plant, all thriving, all allowed to self-sow and self-determine. Then when you get to this part, it opened up into this beautiful lawn. And here there was this incredible Santa Rosa plum tree. And so all throughout the summer, there was always a bowl of plums straight from the tree. Along this side here, we had a beautiful, what was meant to be a claret ash, but was a golden ash, something that used to enrage my grandmother no end, but it was a beautiful, gorgeous tree. And along here we had giant bushes of Justica carnea, And in this corner, we had my great-grandmother's pure white rhododendron that my grandmother had grown from cutting. This part here was one of the most magical parts in the garden. This was the fish pond, totally surrounded by baby's tears moss. And behind it, a verdant, thick planting of ferns. I was obsessed with the way that the lawn transitioned into this incredible moss that cascaded over, and then the water would cut off the edge of that moss so perfectly. It's like a glistening jewel. Then behind the fish pond was my grandmother's pride and joy, her compost heap, which was the engine that ran this whole garden. Then the lawn continued around here, where there's a whole bank of camellias. And then here was a 80-year-old fig tree. It was multi-trunked. And that's where my grandmother taught me about the fascinating cycle of Ficus carnea and how wasps actually get inside the fruit to pollinate it. And the flowers of a Ficus, not carnea, Ficus caricum. Actually, the flowers are inside the fruit, and you need that specific type of wasp to pollinate it. So then you came back along this beautiful lawn path, and then this was my little cubby house. There was this bizarre little, I don't know what you'd describe that as, like an eye drop shape of lawn, totally surrounded again by rhododendrons, hydrangea, macrophyllus, all these kind of lush kind of woodland plants, somehow thriving again in that horrible grey tertiary sand. Then you came out of this lawn area here, and this was the most exciting part of the garden, a giant in-ground swimming pool. And this swimming pool was totally surrounded by these concrete, very simple kind of utilitarian planter boxes that were filled with garish annuals. So in summer, be petunias of every clashing, horrendous colour, which I thought was amazing as a kid. So it was absolutely beautiful. And then behind the pool, there was a giant orange tree. So the land that my grandparents' house was on was actually originally an orange orchard. And this was the last tree remaining from the orchard. And it was a double grafted tree. So it had summer fruiting orange and a winter fruiting orange. So oranges all year round. And then we went back down here. And here was this giant old stump of a tree covered in ivy with a bird bath on top of it. And there were about 40 different species of bird that visited the garden. So it was amazing. It was always full of bird call. And then there were huge shrubs along every single fence line. So when you were standing here in the garden, you couldn't actually see out because it was in a valley. It's actually the headwaters of Elster Creek, which becomes Elwood Canal. So really, again, that idea of the fantasy of this garden, not being able to see any of the edges. You could imagine it was this woodland garden from Mount Macedon that just stretched on for acres and acres. The house ran all the way along the swimming pool, and my grandpa designed it to be a passive solar house. Back in 1970 they built it, which is really quite advanced for that time. So they had eaves facing north. This way was north. And the eaves were the perfect depth. So in winter, the sun, that's a very scientific drawing of the sun, could get into this huge glazed northern side of the house. But in summer, the eave was the right depth, so no sun could get in at all. They had a really huge concrete slab for thermal mass. So it's amazing that all this knowledge existed and people were doing that back in the 1970s, and when we're building houses nowadays, we're still not doing that. So back to the pool. There was no pool fence because we hadn't gone crazy at that point. People actually were responsible for their children. And that meant that the pool was actually an integrated, beautiful part of the garden. Next to the Aegonus flexuosa was another one of the incredible plants in this garden that I found amazingly fascinating, and that was a Macadamia integrifolia that my grandmother brought back from one of our holidays to Noosa in her handbag as a seedling. This tree used to produce fruit all year round. The pool filter was in this weird kind of little half shed building here, and that's where we used to take the nuts and smash them with bricks. We spent hours, my sister and I, smashing macadamia nuts and eating them. It's amazing how simple tasks like that can just keep you entertained for hours as a kid. The land was pretty flat, even though it was the base of the valley, but then it sloped down here at the back of the orange tree. And so this area here we used to get really quite wet. And here you had giant loculias, which in the middle of winter have these incredible pink flowers that just smell so beautiful. And then all the way along this boundary, there were these tall trees. And all this is gone now. It's all been torn down and destroyed. Gardens are always ephemeral. But I can't, in my mind, they always seemed like beech trees, but I don't think they were. It's funny how your brain plays tricks on you like that. This was my grandmother's vegetable garden, and this was an old concrete slab from the previous house that was on this site. And she grew all of her vegetables just heaping compost on top of the concrete. She used to say that the heat of the concrete would make the vegetables grow better. I think she was right. Then, for one of their wedding anniversaries, my grandpa bought the house next door. Which meant that my grandmother suddenly could extend her garden all the way out on this side. So they put in floor-to-ceiling French doors in the living room and then stepped out into this amazing garden here where there was a huge wall here covered in ivy, heterohelix. And this was like a perennial garden bed here with perennial wallflowers, dahlias, incredibly floriferous. There was another pond here, kidney-shaped again, and again lawn paths and this conceal reveal that invited you into this part of the garden. This opened up into a huge kind of curved lawn area here, and in this corner was a jacaranda that was absolutely gigantic. It was probably almost as big as this Angophora in the front, certainly wider. And every Christmas it would be in full bloom, the whole thing, just this amazing awash of purple blooms, creating this purple snow underneath it. In the back corner here, behind the jacaranda, was a Chimonanthus praecox, which is this beautiful Chinese plant called wintersweet that gets these weird, almost like rock pool looking fleshy flowers straight off the stem in midwinter, in the darkest, coldest part of July. And the perfume so sweet. Again, along here, all camellias. My grandmother loved camellias. I wasn't a huge fan of camellias, to be honest. I thought they were kind of a bit granny-ish. But I think if you are a granny, that's probably very acceptable. But I've grown to appreciate them more and more as I get closer to being a granny in my age, for their glossy evergreen leaves and their beautiful structured flowers. Along here, there was a massive passion fruit with the most delicious fruit. And my grandmother then turned this original vegetable garden into a herb garden, and then she grew a giant vegetable garden along here, little sawdust paths. And so that meant that all of her home-cooked meals had these incredible organic produce in it that was just super delicious. Then, along here, all different types of daisy bushes. So we had Argyranthemum, fruticosa, Shasta daisies, dahlias, this riot of colour. It was so beautiful. And then here, there was a little archway where you could walk through back into the perennial garden. And then this part here was the most exciting as a small kid, because this was the wisteria tunnel. So this whole section here was covered in Wisteria sinensis. And you can imagine in early spring just how glorious it was. But they'd let it grow so only a kid could walk through there. As an adult, you'd have to crawl through. So an incredibly exciting place. So this garden has influenced me so much throughout my entire career as a landscape architect and now as a horticultural teacher. And I invite you now to see what it actually looked like. So here is my grandparents and their friends sitting here down by the edge of the pool. Here are my beautiful Betty and Barry, my grandparents, standing here in this beautiful part of the garden. Here's my sister, myself and my dad in the pool. This is Mishmu, the Siamese cat. My grandparents always loved cats, and there was always not just their cat, but so many cats in the garden, bizarrely cohabiting. And this is my great-grandmother's wire plant stand that I still have with me today. Again, their pride and joy. There's the garish petunias growing, and there's that amazing orange tree. I'm not sure if I said before or not, but that was 160 years old, and it still fruited absolutely consistently. The beautiful lawn paths. Again, look at those petunias. It makes your eyes bleed, they're so gross. Here's the garden in spring, late winter. Another shot. You can see the hellhole in that shot. Here's this beautiful shot of the hydrangea macrophyllus. We've got Euphorbia caracus wolfenii. We've got fuchsias. You can see here the macadamia nut tree I was talking about. It's just out of the shot, but you can see the Agonis flexuosa weeping down like a weeping willow. And then finally, here's one of the most beautiful shots where you see these incredible lawn paths doing the conceal and reveal. So this is now a landscape of memory, but I see this landscape and can draw it off by heart. And it'll always be a part of me and is always going to continue to influence my career. So thank you for coming on the journey with me today to experience my grandma's garden.